All right, let's see if we can get this the right level. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here among friends. Sorry to be late, but at least it wasn't as bad when I went to speak in LA and the plane hadn't taken off at 11:20 and I was supposed to speak at noon. But I got there at 1 and everybody waited. And we had a great talk, so hopefully this will be as equally as good. I better move this closer. A little tension there. All right. So what I try and do in this book is do a portrait of the Bay Area, something I wanted to do for a long time. I've also wanted to use this title from Lawrence Ferlinghetti's book of poems, 1953, 51, which I always thought was quite brilliant and captured the double nature of urban life in America. And it seems to fit the situation we're in now. And it's a portrait of the Bay Area as a whole. So one of the things I'm trying to do is not just look at San Francisco, the way everybody does, or even Oakland and Berkeley, but to look at the whole region and think about that as at that scale. Think at that scale. We tend to run between the national scale and our very local scale. So we're either fighting over Berkeley politics or we're fighting over Trump and Trumpian policies. And so we're less good, I think, at thinking at different scales, which as a geographer is kind of a professional conceit. But I still think it's important to look at our whole metropolitan area. So I try to paint this portrait, and it's kind of a portrait of Dorian Gray, because it looks very beautiful. And there's a lot of good things that can be said, that have been said about Silicon Valley, San Francisco, the Bay Area. And so I go through that, and I try to give an honest picture, because I think the point for us who live here is also to realize how important this place is. That, we read lots of books about Manchester in the Industrial Revolution, the shock city of the Industrial Revolution, or Paris, the capital of the 19th century, as Walter Benjamin called it. Or there was a great flurry of books about LA in the 1980s, as the postmodern city and all that. But when we look at the Bay Area, I don't think we realize that this is probably the most important place in the world right now. It's the kind of shooting star of contemporary capitalism. And I like that instead of just saying the star, but the shooting star, because it goes through these periodic huge booms and bubbles. We're very prone to that. We've now been through 3 just in the last 30 years that have been very dramatic. This one hasn't blown up yet, but of course it will. We can talk about that. So we should appreciate that, because I think we on the left, and also just your ordinary citizen living in the Bay Area, says, my God, what's going on here? This, and that we tend to see the housing crisis and the environmental issues, the traffic, and all the negatives, which I will come back to. But we should also realize that we're talking about a very important place. And then in many ways in the vanguard of contemporary capitalism, precisely because it is the world center of the tech industry, which is the biggest, and right now, the biggest and most important industry in the world. And we're the world center of it. And, it's so close to us, we often go, we complain about the techies, or we laugh at Mark Zuckerberg or Elon Musk and their absurd ideas, without perhaps realizing just how critical this place is and what we do. And what we've learned here, and I think in terms of political lessons, what we have to offer to the rest of the country and even to the rest of the world at times. So that's part of the importance of looking at the local, is not just to talk about ourselves, though that's important, bring the story down to the level that people experience it, because that's important. And I've noticed in speaking about this that it really resonates. But also realize that we should be speaking to a larger audience. And I think, as I often say about this book, I took it as a challenge to say, okay, if this is the best capitalism can do, is this good enough? And because I wrote the book for a general audience, I didn't write it specifically for you all. You already know about capitalism, right? I don't have to teach you about that. What I wanted to do is to teach your average, intelligent, often liberal person in the Bay Area what capitalism does and how it works here, and what the shape of the thing is here, and what's the dirty underside of it here. And that's a bit of a challenge. It may seem obvious to us, but it isn't that obvious. And it's important to kind of take what a lot of us who live in the Bay Area have impressions, fleeting impressions. Some of them very strong, depending on what has happened to you, what has happened to your friends, perhaps what group you work with. If you're a teacher, what's happening in schools, if you've been evicted, what's happening there. If you've been foreclosed on, you have a pretty good idea of the specifics of some of the worst elements of the city. But as I think it's important to kind of put together a much broader and much more detailed portrait of what's going on and what's been going on for a long time. Okay, that was a rather long lead-in. So what I do is, the book is officially in 3 parts, but I think it probably should have been in 4, because the opening of it is about the economy. It's about the tech economy. It's about the sort of booming economy of this place, which grew 50% in GDP from 2010 to 2015. If we were a country, we are bigger than Turkey. We're about number 17 in the world. We know that California is number 5, so that's a unit that you get statistics on, but it's harder to see the statistics or hear them about the Bay Area. It's huge. We're up to 8.5 million people now. It's big. And the growth is immense. And of course, it's a high-end growth in many ways. And we are celebrated for this kind of tech-intensive, skilled labor-intensive, the creative class theory of Richard Florida is invented for the Bay Area, for example. And I try to look at those elements and explain why it's happening, but also undercut the typical mythologies about the wonderful entrepreneurship and genius that brings us Facebook and the startup culture and so on. I tried to undermine that because what it's based on is social labor. It's based on immense social labor, social learning, the collective, the general intellect, as Marx called it, that has been developing for over 100 years in this area in electronics, in terms of kind of interactive business model and the use of immense skilled labor. And that is the high road model for economic geographers, economists talking about local development. Everybody wants to be us. But the illusion about it is it's done by these people of genius rather than by social labor. And I think Marxists and leftists understand those processes, those collective processes much better than the typical liberals individualizing all that and the sort of capitalist ideology. In the second part of the book, what I do is then look at class. And of course, as you know, from your experience on the left, Americans have a hard time talking about class and thinking in terms of class. And in my lifetime, on the left, I've seen we talk about it, but average people have a real hard time coming to grips with it. So I try to take the massive inequality which is very much in the air, okay? So this is the first time, in some ways, that class has been talked about expressly in the U.S. since the Occupy movement, really. And these wonderful studies by a few handful of economists about wealth inequality, inequalities become a major topic, as it's just the gulf between the 1% and the rest of the people as enlarged. Well, I look at that, and we in the Bay Area, led by the tech boys, are responsible we're in the vanguard of the creation of inequality. It's not just a generic thing that happens everywhere, but specifically the tech industry. And this kind of creative upper-end economy that we have is notorious for creating inequality from the top. And we have more billionaires per square inch than any city in America. We're number 2 to New York, but New York has 3 times the population. We have 50 of the Forbes 400 billionaires, for example. And you can look at other indexes of the 1%ers, what they call the exceptionally rich, or I forget what it's called. So I have all these statistics in there. And we're generating that kind of inequality at the top. And cities like Boston and San Francisco, that's what happens. Cities like Atlanta, Houston, Miami, the inequality is created more at the bottom because they have immense cheap labor forces. Even in LA has a much bigger low-end labor force, and its inequality is both top and bottom. Ours is more at the top. But what's interesting, and that means, by the way, we have the highest average income of any big metropolitan area in the world. And so that leads to all kinds of statements about, oh, well, you see, this is so great. But then when you look at the working class, I should add a little element about, I do talk not about only about the 1%, but also about the upper middle class, which also Americans, we have a hard time even giving it a name. The professionals, the skilled, I think Marxists, we would more say skilled labor and managers. Barbara Ehrenreich years ago came up with the PMC, but in ordinary parlance, people kind of say upper middle class. It's the top 20%. And if you look at the data on who's gaining in salaries and income and wealth, because the top 5%, 10%, they have a hell of a lot of wealth too. They're more petty bourgeois than they are skilled labor. And those people are just doing extraordinarily well. Their kids aren't very often, but they, and when I say, I mean me as a university professor, I'm in the top 5%. So, that's the upper classes. But who are the other 80%? And how do we talk about them? And what do we know about them? And it's remarkable in all the discussion about how great the Bay Area economy is doing and how wonderful this high road model is. What is always forgotten is that no matter how supposedly high road your economy is, it always has a massive working class and a massive amount of cheap labor. So we have a huge cheap labor force, and here, this is essentially the richest city in the world. About a third of the workers don't earn a living wage. A quarter are at minimum wage. Poverty levels, although they're lower than Houston and Miami and other places in the Midwest, it's still 20% or 22%. There was just this report down in Silicon Valley by their food bank saying that there's 20%, 1/5 of the population suffers regular hunger, on a regular basis, it's a total disgrace. Now, where you do get a lot of conversation is about the homeless. But the homeless are, as we know, it's a very important issue. I do talk about it in the book. But they are, a very small percentage of the overall population. We can talk about them if you want. But what's really important, and I think what sometimes gets out there, is the working poor, the working class poor, people who are working like the devil, working hard, and are still not making it. And in the Bay Area, because cost of living is so high, That includes a lot of people. And even in the Bay Area, the kind of working middle class, that is the middle salaried level, that's been shrinking systematically over the years. So we have a working class that is living the kind of problems of trying to hold life together, trying to deal with the gig economy. Now, the gig economy in the sense of Uber is often greatly exaggerated. But it's important because it's kind of the vanguard of the new edge, sort of forward edge of this kind of labor managed by apps, by computer, by software, and so on, by algorithm. And as we know, there was a recent study in the Bay Area, Uber drivers average $3.67 an hour. But it's important to remember that the tech boys, the tech industry, have been in the vanguard of contingent labor using temps and so-called consultants at every level of their labor force, going back to the 1980s, giving us one of the biggest of that kind of contingent labor forces in the country. And some of them are getting high salaries, but there's no benefits. And they're young, and so, do they think about their health care? Do they think about retirement? Are they putting money away? And how secure is their employment? Even if they're making a lot of money in the tech economy, their employment is often very insecure, either on a personal contract basis or when the next crisis hits. And the crises of 1999, 2000, 2008 were catastrophic even in tech. And so our economy, if you look at employment, it's just doing this. And it was annihilated in the meltdown of 2000. I can come back to that if you're interested, because it's very capitalist crises. There's another point where looking locally matters. Capitalist crisis is not just a world crisis or a United States crisis when it hits. The Bay Area was the worst hit place in the world in 2000 because the tech boom was the bubble of the time. And when it imploded, 40% of all the stock market loss was in 100 top tech companies in the Bay Area. 40%. I mean, people don't realize, and our employment was just wiped out. And the rest of the the rest of the country barely felt it. It's regarded as a very mild recession, but not here. How about the foreclosure crisis? That was centered in California. We think of it as a world crisis, a U.S. crisis, a Wall Street crisis. But by far the largest producer of shitty mortgages was California. But it wasn't anybody even close. And they were being sold, repackaged and sold to suckers in Iceland when it all blew up. Who was foreclosed on in greater numbers than any place in the world? Here. Okay, coming back to the working class, I just wanted to finish on a note that I think we might want to talk about more in this audience, because I think it's an interesting puzzle for the left and for everybody. Because what's happened in California, it's not just the Bay Area, but in California, because we were the #1 receiving area of the new immigration, starting in the late 1970s and through the 1980s, the working class, there's been this massive transformation. Social transformation isn't just, the demographics has changed. Class has changed. And we know very well on the left, because we've thought about this for years, and we thought about it for years. What's the relationship between class and race? What's the relationship between class and gender? It's not self-evident, is it? And there's a lot of friction, isn't there? But something very strange and important has happened in California. The working class is now 3/5 to 2/3 people of color. That's who the working class is. And if you look at the cheap labor classes, the bottom third, the bottom half of the working class, it's overwhelmingly people of color. And when you get down to the bottom 20%, we tend to think of it as those poor white guys in wiped out in Indiana, southern Indiana, or West Virginia. And it's single women of color working crappy jobs, insecure jobs, and trying to raise children right here. You don't have to go to West Virginia. And of course, the whole idea, the whole discourse, the liberal discourse, which of the debates in the Democratic Party is, when you say working class, you mean white guys, white coal miners, or old, white workers in Detroit who lost their jobs. But that's not the way it is. I remember years ago, that great film, Roger and Me, by Michael Moore. I showed it in a class, and this must be almost 30 years ago, and I had one little Filipina girl come up to me afterwards and she said, "Oh my God," she said, "I didn't realize there was a place where white people did crappy jobs, where white people were workers." And that's kind of the thing of California, because if you look at who the elite are, certainly the 1%, and we've seen this in spades, and the data are so clear about it, and the imaging is so clear, it's white men. And boy, is it men, as the battles over misogyny in the tech industry and elsewhere, but especially in tech, have shown. It's white men. So the common enemy has a color, it has a gender. Now, whether that means that the working class can meld itself into something that's a class for itself, as we lefties like to say, is a big question of our time. And in the end of the book, I talk about politics, and so I usually put this at the end, but I don't want to say it now. We're liberals and Democrats are very proud of, I keep trying to button my shirt, that's an obsessive thing. Oh, well, forget it. I'll stop doing that. I don't have too many nervous tics, but that's one. Anyway, they talk about what a blue state California is. And I have my last chapter is about politics. It's about, is there anything left of the left close? And we'll want to come back to that. But just on this point about the blue state, what people like Thomas Frank are saying, I think quite rightly, Mike Davis has said this, others writing in the wake of the 2016 disaster have said, it's not like there's this identity politics over here and there's working class politics over here. And the great mistake of Hillary Clinton and the mainstream conservative Democrats is to think of, they haven't thought about the working class anyway, and since Bill and Hillary took over the DLC. And they don't even understand that the working class is those white coal miners and single mothers of color working in healthcare in California. And what's happened in California politics is interesting because it's actually shown the veracity of the critique of mainstream Democrats. It's not, and much as my intellectual, professional type, enlightened friends who have a lefty background, we're all 68ers and all that, we say, the reason, the Bay Area is so progressive and California's blue is because we're so smart.
Sure.
Yeah. And those techie guys are progressive. Not. The tech billionaires, have they said a word against the tax cuts? No, they love the tax cuts. They are some of the worst tax evaders in history. So, who turned around California? It's working class people of color. It's the immigrants and their children and grandchildren who were so pissed off at Pete Wilson and the Republicans and neoliberalism in general that by about 2000, the state started to turn around massively and became blue. They want good schools. They want decent health care. They want decent pensions and better lives for their children. And they believe they actually have a moral discourse, a kind of moral economy about taking care of people that I hate to say an awful lot of my white brethren have no idea about. It's literally every man for himself. Okay, so that's the second part of the book, is class. The third part actually looks at the way this works out is an urban system. And I'm a geographer, I'm an urbanist, so I love that shit, and some of you might not. But I try to make it interesting, and I think it is pretty interesting. But I think some of you, or most of you, will actually say, oh yeah, that's what's going on here. Because the biggest thing that we're all aware of, the biggest contradiction of the current condition of the Bay Area is the housing crisis, right? Yeah. But the housing crisis, so I have a whole chapter on that, but I preface it with another chapter about the takeover of the central cities by the upper classes. Because what we're seeing is not just gentrification. That's not a word. That's actually not a satisfactory term for what's going on. Gentrification means, oh yeah, some artists and trendy upper class people moved into an old working class declining neighborhood and started fixing it up and la 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 la, and you get all the neighborhood transformation. No, we're living through something that David Harvey's written about a lot, which is that the entire urban systems get transformed by capital once a generation or once an epoch, depending on how you're going to slice up history, to serve the new needs of capital. And what we have is a whole new system based on this tech industry, high-end, paying the skilled workers enormous salaries, incredible accumulation of capital at the top and enrichment at the top. And then these guys, and concentration of these industries and these key jobs in the West Bay, in the central cities, and then the rediscovery by those trendy people of the benefits of urbanity. And, starting with my generations or baby boomers who discovered, if you go to, who started traveling and saying, if you go to Europe or Latin America and then later Asia, you find these incredibly interesting cities, and in the U.S. you have all these boring suburbs. Or you have cities that have been totally emptied out in the center, just annihilated like Detroit, which isn't a very attractive model in many ways. And so people move back to the cities, but it's based on underlying economic trends and underlying class trends, which leads it to being, when we look at the gentrification of San Francisco City, it's the colonization of key urban space by the upper classes, turning it into playgrounds for them. And the other side of it, which you all know well, is not just evictions, but which there have been tens of thousands, but hundreds of thousands of people displaced simply by the pricing system as the housing prices have shot up, and people fleeing, working class people having to live in Stockton and commute all the way to the inner Bay Area. Which means that the Bay Area has more absurd commutes than any city in the country. And by the way, it also means the Bay Area is still growing well into the Central Valley. We have an inland empire, just like LA, whether we admit it or not. So stop just talking about Oakland, Berkeley, and San Francisco, or even Silicon Valley, because the Bay Area goes from Cloverdale to San Juan Bautista, out to Madera, and Merced, and Modesto, and Vacaville, and Dixon. And it's a huge, huge area. And at the center, the people, working class people, being driven out to these areas. And the center's being turned into this enormous playground for the well-to-do. And it's being rebuilt in the process. Of course, we see the immense building process We can come back to that. The housing crisis. This place has some of the most expensive housing in the world. It has some of the most unaffordable housing on average in the world. Basically, only the top 20% can afford central housing or average housing in the entire Bay Area, in the metropolitan area. It's kind of beyond belief. And what I do in that chapter, which we can talk about more, is I try to undercut the prevailing ideology, which is so dominant everywhere in the U.S. and especially around here. Essentially, we can call it the YIMBY ideology, but it has a legitimate kind of ancestry with genealogy amongst economists, including some very liberal economists, colleagues of mine at Berkeley, Paul Krugman, who believe this shit, that the reason housing prices have gone through the roof is because of you. It's because of you goddamn people who oppose new building in your neighborhoods. That's why it's a supply restriction problem created by the people, as if it had nothing to do with demand. But the problem is overwhelmingly an absurd demand driven by 3 or 4 things. The richest economy in the world, with massive inequality, so most of that enrichment's at the top, growing at an absurdly fast rate in which housing supply cannot possibly catch up, no matter who you're building it for, where you're building it. Housing is not ice cream, it is not iPhones, it is not hats. You can't expand the supply rapidly. Everybody knows that. Who works in urban studies or in development. It takes years to build new housing, especially when you're going up rapidly. It's easier at the suburban fringe, which is why suburbs keep growing like crazy, because the developers love that. It's a lot easier. So they fall behind. They have to fall behind. And the prices shoot through the roof because you get a bottleneck effect on top of everything else. It's all on the demand side. It's kind of like water, which I discuss in my environmental chapter. It's like saying, oh, you know, California's running out of water. Oh, is that right? We don't have enough water. Poor California doesn't have any water. 80% of the water is used by agribusiness in the Central Valley, Imperial Valley. You and I, your bathing and toothbrushing and toilet flushing is a literal drop in the bucket. What are we doing to deal with the problem of drought, climate change, water shortages? We're going to try and build more dams and a couple of tunnels under the delta, which is insane, because the problem isn't supply, and besides which, there isn't any more water. There isn't any more supply to be had because we built all the good dams, and the problem of irregularity, of variability, is only going to get greater, is already getting greater with climate change. The problem is on the demand side. And it's places like Westlands growing huge hundreds of thousands of acres of almonds, which they have to keep wet, even in a drought, on terrible land that has no water, has no groundwater, and is toxic beside. And the problem is that Westlands should be shut down, not that we should be raising Shasta Dam. Well, the same problem in housing. The problem isn't that we opponents, that people who oppose willy-nilly crazy development, who question high-rise development around BART station because of the displacement and gentrification of neighborhoods, to blame it on those people instead of on the rich people who have all the money, who are driving up the prices, is nuts. All right, so then I wrap up the book, and I'll wrap this up because I can see your eyes starting to glaze over, with a part on looking to the future. And part of that's about politics. Where are we going to go? That's the last chapter. Part of it's about the environment. How are we going to face up to the environmental challenges? I wrote another book on how wonderful the Bay Area is in our environmental movement. I call it my liberal book. But I'm very proud of it anyway, because actually the environmentalists here were very radical. The reason they succeeded is how radical they became, even if they seemed to be a bunch of rich ladies and upper-class professionals. They were totally opposed to accumulate. That's Moses and the prophets. And they stood in front of the bulldozers, and they stopped stupid development, and they made the Bay Area a better place. But the environmental problems that we face with climate change are so at a different scale now that isn't going to do it anymore. We have sea level rise because Greenland is melting, because the West Antarctic ice sheet might give way. And we're planning for maybe 11 inches of sea level rise by 2050, by maybe 2100, when it might be 9 feet. What are we going to do about that? Not much is being, people aren't really, and agencies aren't really facing up to that. When the East Bay mud sewage plant goes underwater in a high tide, the shit will really hit the fan. We'll be inundated in it. So that's a problem. Our treatment of water is a problem. We have a very progressive carbon policy in California, led by a lot of people from the Bay Area. That's great. That's very good. Of course, the Trump people can't stand it and so on, so we can be proud of that. But then, what are we doing about wildfires? The wildfires have gotten bigger and bigger and more frequent because of climate change. And then what do? We're still building our cities into the wildfire zones. Who's controlling that? Nobody. And we do a lot of really insane urban planning in light of the wildfires. And those wildfires last year, I think you probably heard this, that they wiped out all the carbon gains that the state had made through its SB 32 policies for 1 year and maybe for more. So where are we going? So that's an interesting chapter. And then finally, I do a chapter on the ideology of tech. And when I started this a couple years ago, I wanted to show that, I wanted to get at the fantasies of these guys that maybe not you, but literally hundreds of millions, if not billions of people have swallowed. And they've swallowed, it's Marx's old problem. It's not that the ruling class makes this shit up from whole cloth. It is the ideology problem, the fetish of capital, the fetish of money, the fetish of technology, derived from the practical developments, the practical life that we're all immersed in. And millions and billions of people were immersed in this tech world that they've created. And for good reason. Some of it's amazing. Some of it seems really wonderful. I use it all the time. I've got my little iPhone in my pocket. And I use it for some good reasons. But what's happened is we've gotten enmeshed in this tech world. Well, and what we see is, of course, now, more clearly than ever, is that we're enmeshed in a system of immense monopoly power of these companies. The corruption of that monopoly power in terms of the kind of profits they're making, the way they're making the profits by selling parts of you. We make a big deal about the traffic in kidneys, in the world, which is disgusting. The sex traffic in young women, which is disgusting. Well, what about the traffic in the parts of you, the knowledge about you and what you do every day that's being sold by these guys for billions and billions of dollars? Well, I think we're much more aware of that, and we're also aware that it's corrupted our civic life, our democracy. It's led to mass misinformation, not just new information, Wikipedia, I love Wikipedia, but mass misinformation. Mass, not just friendship, but bullying and harassment and all kinds of negatives. Well, when I started writing that chapter a couple of years ago, I started reading something going, what am I going to say? Because I was pretty innocent about this. And amazingly, since 2016, I think the social education that's going on has been immense. And I think we're much more aware of all this, and there's wonderful books written and articles written about this now. But in the end, it is a classic problem of capitalism, that these guys come in, they made capitalism exciting again. They made all these new technologies. We all changed our lives, fascinated people, captured the youth. Thousands and tens of thousands of young people, this is what they want to do. This is where they want to be. They made capitalism fun, exciting. And what happens with capitalism is because it's always on the move, it always produces a new modernity. This is the latest. It produces this massive fetishism of progress, modernity, and technology. That that people under capitalism have fallen under the spell for 200 years now, at least. And if you oppose it in any way, you're a Luddite. You're backward. Oh, Dad, you don't know anything. And, it's very corrupting of human relations and privacy and ultimately democracy, which, it may sound like an abstract ideal, but it's all we've got to oppose those bastards. And maybe I'll leave it on that note and then start taking questions. Thank you for bearing with me.
Let me just grab this real quick. All right, everybody, so we'll take questions or comments, and if you want to say something, we request that it's, a minute or two, let everybody have a chance to speak.
I do want to say, by the way, the book is kind of thick, but it sits lightly in the hand. Thanks to my wonderful publisher back there, Ramsey Cannon, and the PM Press people. It's so readable. It's so beautiful. It has immense amount of really interesting facts, and it's written in a most accessible way for the intelligent public. And it sneaks at Marxism, just keeps, and you guys will see that very clearly, and hopefully the liberals won't see it coming. But it'll get them by the short hairs. All right, question.
Yeah, I feel like we're kind of...
Oh, do we have to use the mic?
I'm sorry, what happened? I'm speaking, hello?
Yeah, I'm sorry, hold on one second. This lady had her hand up first, so she'll talk and we'll come back to you.
Okay.
Sorry, my fault.
No problem.
My fault.
I didn't know what happened.
Thank you. This is really, really fascinating. In the past, if you had an industry develop like Pullman and Kaiser shipyards and all that, they built housing for their workers. Is there any chance that we might get to that point again where Silicon Valley will build housing for the lower 30% of the workers?
No, but I do have two more things to say besides. Well, nobody, I'll get to it. In this housing market, nobody is intentionally going to build housing for the bottom third. You don't make any money doing that. The only way you do that is if you're forced to do it by set-aside requirements of cities.
What if they don't get any workers?
Well, they're worried about that. But let me say that despite the examples of Kaiser and Pullman were notorious paternalistic capitalists. They're rare in the annals of capitalism. At times, capitalists have had to do this. They did it in Lowell, Massachusetts. But by and large, they discovered that it's much better to let the workers deal with their own reproduction and to let the developers and the local politicians deal with housing, because when you built your own housing, like Pullman discovered to his regret, it actually solidified the sense of class antagonism rather than making people like you more. So, but there is stuff going on because some of the tech people realize how horrendous the situation is. And Google in particular has bought up a huge swath of kind of industrial apartment land in Mountain View between the Central Expressway and Highway 101, Bayshore. 9,000 acres, which is the size of the Stanford campus. I mean, it's huge. And they're going to build a giant housing commercial complex, which has been approved by the city of Mountain View now. They also are doing some good work. They want to build decentralized some of their Googleplex offices near the Diridon station in the west side of downtown San Jose, which is a good move in view of transportation. It'll be a mix of offices and high-rise buildings. But most of the housing in those developments will be housing for their kind of tech employees, which is not the bottom third at all. There are probably other examples like that. I mean, the Silicon Valley industrial councils like the Manufacturers Group, they've known for a long time that there's a need for greater density, greater coordination of housing, and they've worked with environmentalists like Green Belt Alliance and so on this. So they're enlightened in that sense, but they're not enlightened in the sense of, oh, you know what, you ought to really tax us heavily and then have a massive public housing program. That's the kind of enlightenment that class prevents them from having and that nobody talks about anymore. But because there's no money, mass money for housing from the federal government anymore, thanks to the neoliberals. Did you want to add a comment on that back there? Okay. Did I satisfy you? Okay.
Hold on. Well, this lady was next, so we'll go with her.
Oh, okay, so I already forgot what I was going to say, and I was all ready to say it, and I don't like being interrupted.
Well, we'll come back when you remember. We'll get you.
Well, I want to say,
We promise.
Something, and that's that there's so many problems. I think a lot of people are just kind of numb from everything. Like, it seems totally overwhelming to me that every time you turn around, there's something blowing up and all the fake news. I mean, this is a first, I think we're at a big pivotal change in society, in the brain too, because when have we in the past ever had to deal with all of this at once? Yep. And it's beyond our capacity at this point. Now, I know maybe younger people or my grandson, I don't know, but I'm just leaving every day. I go, I gotta get out of here. I gotta get out of here. I'm going to go look for political asylum in another country. Yeah, I'm in Cuba. I don't care how poor they are. I
have a surprising number of friends who I hear this from. Well, look, in general, you're right. And I think we're all grappling with the 24-hour news cycle, the tweets of a fascist president, of a crazy man in the White House, with trying to keep up with modernity, which is very destabilizing to older people, and then our cities being turned on its head. But what I'm trying to do in this book, and I think in this kind of a talk, is say, maybe, okay, try to keep Trump in the background. Try to keep, we can't solve it all. And yet, right here in our backyard, so to speak, are immense problems that local activists are trying to tackle, whether it's a more enlightened healthcare policy, whether it's a more enlightened carbon policy, or whether it's a more enlightened housing policy, rent control, overturning Costa-Hawkins.
Yeah.
That's fantastic and has to be done. In fact, what local activists have been doing in housing for years is absolutely what they should have been doing. The thing you do in this kind of an overheated housing market, the first thing to do is try to put the brakes on demand. try to put the brakes on evictions, try to put the brakes on the speculators. And you do that through rent and eviction and condo conversion control. And we knew that 30 years ago, did it, started doing it across California, and needless to say, the landlords, who are a segment of the capitalist class, and by the way, remember, who's that bastard who passed Proposition 13? Jarvis was the head of the Southern California Apartment Owners Association and an old Orange County neo-reactionary or neocon, fascist, whatever you want to call it. Those guys know where the danger is. And we present a real danger to their whole system when we do things like set aside too much land, stop pumping all the water to agribusiness that they want, and take housing out of the market, which is what you have to do in a crisis.
Okay, we'll go with my friend in the back with the black hoodie.
Okay, so look at that microphone. Okay, so bear with me if this is a crazy question. You don't necessarily have to.
There are no crazy questions.
Well, let's see.
There are some crazy people in Berkeley, but no crazy questions.
I would imagine if there was an urban geographer who focused, as you do in California, but on West Virginia, they would be able to tell us a lot about what preceded the major strike movement that we saw there. And I wonder if you, not as a prediction, but more as a general speculative fiction, could imagine what are the things that are weighing on people that we could imagine just exploding in this state. Because I think there are a lot, and I'd be interested from an urban geographer standpoint, because I think it's something very striking, no pun intended, that we're very acclimated to the idea that the way, one of the few, as you said, one of the few means we have to affect change is at the voting booth. And we may be entering into a different time period when I look at the gains that the teachers have won for education in the states where they've gone on strike. It's phenomenal compared to anything that's been accomplished through legislation and voting. And I think that's very much our perspective, that in fact our real lever for change, which is present at all times, because the working class does the work of society, is strikes, movements. That's where we can really change things. So your perspective on the potential future struggle in California?
Well, ask no small questions. Well, I grapple with this, and I kind of go through what I see as the key movements, and I'm not going to claim that I can tell you where it's going to line up or what's going to break through. Those teacher strikes were a kind of amazing surprise in some of the least likely places. And it does give one hope. The conditions have gotten so terrible for education in those places. California got really terrible too, and there was, Prop 98, and there have been some efforts. But, we did have that tax in 2012, 14, 12, where we did add money, the 1% tax that did for a certain number of years. Jerry Brown finally went along with it if it were terminated after a few years. But so there have been some fights back that have been successful on education. There's been, in the teachers union here, in a way, they're so powerful and so present at the state level on a lot of very important policies that we take them for granted. And I assure you that those people suing the LA school district to break teachers unions, and this horrible case that's before the Supreme Court coming out of Southern California, are efforts to break the power of the teachers unions in California, which the capital class can't stand. But there's a whole array of movements. There's wonderful union organizing, really inventive union organizing going on down in Silicon Valley around food service workers. They've organized, the buses. That was a wonderful protest movement, getting on the buses, kind of led by, really left activists in San Francisco. But what quickly happened was the Teamsters organized the bus drivers. Very important, I think. And food service workers, very important drives in healthcare to organize in-home healthcare and things like that. So union movement, the Fight for 15, essential, and been pretty important. The living wage movement around California. But it's kind of episodic. Then I would add things like the decriminalization movement, which has a lot of problems, but is also, we locked up more people per capita than anywhere in the world in the 80s and 90s. And we have a lot to answer for, right up through the liberals like Jerry Brown. And that's a really important fight. The Black Lives Matter, the immigrant rights battles that are going on are fierce, and a lot of great groups and a lot of great activism. But it's hard. It's scary times. How do you fight the fucking migra with all these rage? California cities and then the state have stood up and said, we're a sanctuary state. It isn't saving everybody, but it's helping, and it's an act of, I think that's got a lot of attention and built a lot of agreement amongst Californians in defense of immigrants. I don't think Californians, I don't know what percentage actually buy Trump and Trump kind of anti-immigrant rhetoric, but not very many. And if you remember that in the 1980s, we invented FAIR, Federation Americans for Immigration Reform, the worst of the anti-immigrant movement started here. We built the first wall with the help of our senators and Senator Feinstein and President Clinton and so on. So again, A, we have a lot to answer for, and so a lot of work to overturn that legacy, and B, the turnaround on this has been phenomenal. Now, whether it makes for a nice romantic resistance, Star Wars, that's a local son who came up with Star Wars, and everybody grabbed, the resistance, that's a great name, I love it. And if that's what works for you to use movie themes, and I think a lot of people do, and okay. But do we really have a resistance that comes together? I think we have a lot of fragments. I see a lot of solidarity building around various movements. It's not just black people doing Black Lives Matter. I mean, they're obviously the key and the vanguard, but an awful lot of white leftists and white liberals are absolutely behind that and outraged by police slaughter of young black men and incarceration. So I think there are a lot of solidarities that have been built and are being built. But where that spark comes from, to get this thing has to explode to some degree, and that's what we don't have. And a lot of our older models of, if we just build the party and we just have the Leninist vanguard, not too many people really buy that anymore. But revolutions happen, and West Virginia teacher strikes happen. And they come often sort of out of nowhere. And I'm not sure how, that's the old problem for the left. Can we really make it happen? Well, we certainly can if we're out there working hard and mobilizing people and making a lot of racket.
Okay, take a round of hands. Sir, you in the back with the hat?
Yeah, thanks for your book. It's not just affordable housing. I just read where the bridge tolls that are going up in the Bay Area, parking going up, restaurants becoming unaffordable, food has gotten really expensive. Recently I ran into a couple places in downtown San Francisco where coffee was $5 a cup. So this is all affecting the quality of our life for the average person. And it's, all this success is at our expense. Comment on it.
Well, you know, I think the thing to see about, to try and get people to understand about capitalism is it's a runaway train in moments like this. And we're all running after it, and we're all trying to put a little brake on here, turn a switch to get the damn thing from going off the cliff. And it's really hard. It's also a scale problem because, you know, we're somehow San Francisco or Berkeley or Oakland are supposed to solve the homeless problem, solve the housing problem, solve inequality. How do we do that? You know, something like when you have 4 massive Republican tax cuts in 40 years, when you have financial deregulations and the financial sector growing to 20 to 25% of all corporate profits. Those are macro level issues that is very hard to resist at the local level, and yet those are the things that are pumping up this immense bloated wealth at the top that is driving our obscene housing markets, is driving people out of their homes and even onto the streets. And so we are left kind of sweeping up the residue of this. Now, that doesn't mean you can't do anything locally, and there have been, like I said, some very important efforts to control housing prices, to control the actions of the tech companies. You know, when you finally regulated Airbnb in San Francisco, it turned out that what the left was saying about thousands of units going off the market because of commercial landlords exploiting Airbnb, it turned out to be absolutely true. And a couple thousand units came back on the market because of that thing. So there are lessons to be learned about regulating, but up until now, it's kind of been anything goes, and that isn't going to work. And tech is only going to deliver us to the same old problems that we've seen 1,000 times before, as well as some new ones about monopoly power, about, you know, the power of the capitalist class, and the need for the working class to oppose that and insist on affordable housing money, affordable bridge tolls, and so on. How about mass transit, which just sucks in the Bay Area? I mean, they put all the money, not only does it suck, we don't even support our bus systems. It is well known that buses are most efficient and serve the people the most. And they get peanuts out of the federal funds that are distributed by the Metropolitan Transportation Commission. How many of you know that and how it works? And I mean, why aren't we rioting down at the Metropolitan, the MTC? It seems kind of corny, but it's crucial to what's going on here.
Okay, so I saw a group of hands come up earlier, so I don't know if you feel comfortable. Maybe we take a couple questions at once, or?
Oh, yeah, well, maybe we should do that, because I blather on too much after each one.
Okay, my friend in the back, go for it.
Okay, so I was wondering if you had any projections as for what you see the future of the Bay Area economy looking like, because one thing I think about, I have friends that think, oh, well, you know, we can wait till this like crazy housing bubble explodes and, you know, the housing prices in the Bay Area go back down. And it seems to me, because of the tech industry, that even if that happens in other parts of the US, it might not happen here. So I'm wondering if I'm off base with that assumption, or yeah, if you could just kind of paint a picture for what you see of the future if we don't successfully curtail or restrict it.
Okay.
Okay, well, we'll
Another
take one more.
2 or 3. Take 2 or 3.
Okay, lady up here with the notebook.
Thank you.
Here, wait just a moment. There you go.
Thank you. So, I know capitalists are Republicans and they're Democrats and they're Libertarians, but I specifically am thinking about the rise of the right-wing Republicans and Libertarians, the right-wing radical movement that has been going great guns for at least 40 years. and how they have just infiltrated, starting at dog catcher level and on up and up. And to me, that is the spark that could cause the explosion if people really got aware of what they are doing. When Obama couldn't appoint a Supreme Court justice, I couldn't figure this out. This just didn't work the way things are supposed to work. And then I read this book called Democracy in Chains by Nancy McLean, and she just explains it. So I was so excited I wanted to go to the rooftops and yell, but I went to my mailbox instead, and Jim Hightower's Lowdown magazine devoted all 4 pages to Democracy in Chains, to that book. So I just think people need to understand what it is. It is not normal. Trump isn't normal, but he's just a product of where they have been going for all these years. In the meantime, I'm trying to do my little bit, and I brought petitions for Prop 13 reform.
Excellent.
So if anybody wants to sign one at the end, I'm happy.
Excellent.
Okay, if you'd like to speak, people can raise your hand. I think we'll take our last one for now, and then we'll circle back. Gentleman here.
Yeah, just have a quick question on your thoughts on divisions within the capitalist class, California, the ruling class. I know it's a topic we've talked about before. I mean, an obvious one is between agribusiness and, say, the cities, which we need water as well, and are actually far wealthier. But there are many such divisions, and those are also fissures for which movements have opportunities within those kinds of conflicts. So I'm interested in the research for your book, most recently, when it's fresh for you, what sorts of maybe surprises you uncovered in that sort of area, and then what divisions you might see opening up in subsequent years. Then we'll give you other examples.
Okay. All right. First question, I do foresee, that there will be a major downturn. As a good Marxist, I've predicted 10 of the last 5 financial crises. Actually, I predicted them all, the last, I think, 4 or 5 quite successfully in my teaching, but I always did it at least 2 years too soon. And this time has really pissed me off again because, if you looked at the data, it peaked in 2015, started down, and then there was this whole anticipation of the tax cuts. And Europe then also came out of its doldrums a bit, and China kind of recovered. And so the world economy sort of picked up in 2017, which, by the way, it's now kind of going down again. So it's coming. It's not going to be as bad as 2007-8, I don't think, because the housing mortgage bubble was so intense. The dot-com bubble also was so absurd. Of course, the problem with predicting this stuff is a lot of the most absurd things are hidden from us. So I'm a devoted reader of the Financial Times, trying to figure out, is it the corporate bond market that's going to blow up, or the REITs are going to blow up? And you do see things that have grown at absurd rates, kind of like mortgages did, subprime mortgages did 10 years ago. Now, when a collapse comes and the downturn comes, again, there's this problem that I mentioned, that who's going to be hit the hardest? Well, I do think we'll get hit pretty solidly because we've been so overheated in this market. There's a lot of loose capital, Chinese money and European money and New York money. It just has flooded into the Bay Area to be a part of this hot economy. It's flooded in and bought up apartment buildings and office buildings and of course, stocks and invested venture capital and so on. And a lot of that's going to go away because, that kind of portfolio money. We know in crises like Thailand in 1997, boy, does that stuff leave as soon as there's a problem. So it could be pretty dire for us. Will housing prices collapse? I think rentals are less sway less than house prices, so that's not going to do a lot of the working people much good. But, I think, yes, they are going to go down, but just waiting and hoping, maybe that's not a good enough strategy. Okay, then the second, your question about, about Trump, and so, yes, you're right, Trump is I like to call him the corpse flower of republicanism. This thing that blooms in the Berkeley Botanical Garden every few years and smells like a dead body. But, the greenhouse has been cultivated by the Republicans for 40 years now. The right wing, the neocons, whatever you want to call them. And now it's, turned proto-fascist, because you've got such crazy people in there who have no respect for anything about democracy or the rules and so on. And this only split I see in the ruling class is kind of, I think there are a lot of kind of Republican liberals, Democratic, neoliberals who are horrified, who actually have kind of woken up, call of it. You can see this in the editorial David Brooks effect, you might call it, or something, But how important are they? Trump's got 40% of the people with Fox News and all completely bamboozled still. And that's pretty scary. And so what do you do about that? Other than pray? Again, all you can do, I think you can do a lot of education and a lot of militant work here. If we can't build those solidarities, if we can't build opposition, systematic opposition on a wide number, I do believe in letting 100 flowers bloom, and many opposition movements that respect each other, who try to work together, but who represent different issues and so on. And that's what we can work on. I thought in particular you brought up the libertarians, and then Eddie asked about splits in the ruling class. When I started writing about the politics of the tech capitalists, I think I was pretty naive. I was thinking, they do have this libertarian thing, kind of. They're social liberals, but economic conservatives. They're kind of for every man doing, they'll support legalization of marijuana, whoop-de-doo. Which is great, I think it's fine. I think it's really important, actually, to break down the old war on drugs and criminalization of drugs and so on. But, boy, I ended up thinking, man, these guys, they talk a line, but the real top ones, end up falling in line with their class interest and money making. A good one is Mark Benioff. I mean, he was one of the good ones. We all say, oh yeah, he invests in children's hospitals. What a good guy. But I think the skyscraper, which, by the way, I don't hate. A lot of people hate skyscrapers. I kind of like them, being an urban. I don't know what it is. Maybe I'm weird. Maybe the phallic thing does it for me. I don't know. But Benioff, but the skyscraper probably says more about Mark Benioff than Children's Hospital does. And I noticed that, I don't know if any of you saw that at Davos this last time, he was praising Trump. So much for that savior. The only guy left, what tech billionaire has been on the right side? The only one is, the financier who's financing the impeachment ads. Yeah, Tom Steyer. So, one, that's not a very good record. Most of them are really bad, and even when they're Democrats, they have this view that a kind of the tech and the Democratic conservatives are what is needed to stabilize things and save us from the left and the Bernieites. No, really. But I will say one thing I discovered, though, is that there are signs amongst the techies, that is, the coders, the ordinary tech workers, who may be overpaid, but a lot of them aren't, and they're definitely overworked. And a lot of them are struggling. They were shocked by this. They're the ones who've done any organizing within tech. And, you know, we need to talk to them as much as possible because they are a lot of young, I mean, some of them are Stanford frat boys, and you'll never get to them because they're really members of the upper classes. But there are a lot of them who are kind of naive idealists. They bought into the promise of progress and young people can do wonderful things and so on, and this idea of the free market and so on. But it's really sad to see, I'm told by Zelda Bronstein, whose work I really respect, when you go to these conferences of the YIMBYs, and she actually does the dirty work of going and listening to these people and writing very good articles about them, there's a lot of naive young techies who have bought into YIMBY because they say, shit, I can't get housing and I earn this six-figure salary and I'm living in some box, or I'm sharing, you know, with 6 other people and the beds are, you know, it's like Flophouse. So there's a lot of educating we need to do to capture that group. And you know, they're not the lowest of the low. Don't fulfill a lot of our dreams of the working class. But they're part of a larger coalition if you're going to turn this thing around. So that's one specific thing. And you know, Eddie, I don't really see, I thought I'd see more splits in the ruling class. I'm not seeing them. The ruling class, you know, they've gotten so rich and so disconnected from reality. We already saw this under Bush. And I had arguments with my rationalist lefty friends, like, why would Bush invade Iraq? It makes no sense. And it comes down to, like, his Oedipal complex. You know, shit like that. And it totally and being completely under the thumb of a madman like Dick Cheney, who's no different than the madmen who surround Trump, and women, some. So I don't know, I don't see it. I think they're too busy sending rocket ships to Mars, and they think that's going to save us. So I say we need to get more of the money out of their hands and into our hands.
Okay, we'll take maybe another round. Let's go, my friend in the back.
We have an impatient moderator. They're not leaving in droves yet, so there's hope.
Okay.
And this fellow in the back.
Thanks for your talk. Yeah, I just kind of wanted to address a couple things that keep getting thrown around, which is sort of like, what is our role in this and how do we make a difference? And I think you've kind of touched on it through your talk. I mean, let's look at the environment. Let's look at the fact that, you know, for the 99% in America, which is, you know, the richest country in the world, as well as all around the world for people, the system isn't working out for us, and it's very cruel. Either you have, you know, migrant crises and refugees, or, you know, full-out war, or you have just complete systems that don't work for people, whether we have a lack of housing here, lack of food. The fact is that we have more than enough resources, we have more than enough food, we have more than enough, even empty houses here. There's like a lot of empty apartments, and you know, we could build more, but the fact is that it's not going to be built for the people that need it. And so out of this, my take is that our job is to be really realistic of what are we dealing with here, what are we dealing with as young people, especially facing global warming, facing, you know, within 50 years, what's going to happen to Oakland? Which parts of Oakland are going to be underwater, literally? What's going to happen in the next earthquake? I mean, if we're going to talk about building and how it needs to be built, they're willing to build for the rich while they understand that when an earthquake comes, those exact buildings are a huge danger of collapsing, etc. But I think, yeah, I mean, our job is to say that the system isn't working and that it isn't a matter of just getting a larger, chunk of money, because we keep coming back to the same fact that so long as we don't actually have control over how do we design our own transportation system and how do we actually have a say in our jobs, how do we have a say in what's available to us, what resources, do we allow 80% of the water to be used for big ag, or what else do we need to use it for? How do we redesign the system? And I think that when we talk about the problem not being in, I don't know how you said it, but you talked about this kind of difference in demand versus what's being produced. I think the problem isn't that we need to put pressure on, the capitalists, the 1%, to give us more. I think it's really to be very honest with ourselves that if we want another world, if we want a world to survive in, we need to be able to make those decisions. We need to be able to have a real say in, designing the work environments that we want.
Look, you're absolutely right, and what you're saying is what we need is a whole new system that we can call socialism, or whatever term really moves you. I thought it was amazing how popular Bernie Sanders, very simple, it's a kind of social democratic line, but he used socialism in American politics, and he had huge crowds and huge support from especially young people. So I think ultimately you're right. Look, I'm the bad person to ask these kind of questions. I'm an old intellectual, and what we do is I'm really good for giving you a great analysis of this and that and the other, but I complicate things and so on. And in politics, you got to simplify things, and you got to mobilize people, and explosions come, and you need to ignite those. And that's how you're going to get that kind of major change you're looking for. And you're right, it's not just about lobbying this and begging for that and having a nice policy here. I think what's amazing about the Bay Area in my lifetime is we have people here who know how to do everything, pretty much solve every problem. They know how to rein in the algorithms. They know how to build low-income housing. They know how to deal with climate change. They know all these things, and if they could simply be unleashed, we could change the world, and that's the issue.